Welcome to the Addison Gallery of American Art. We are located on the campus of Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. The museum actually opened in 1931, and it's celebrating its 90th anniversary this year. The Addison was one of the first museums that was solely devoted to the art of the United States, and the collection has grown to more than 23,000 works, ranging from the 18th century to the present, and it's home to a significant and forward-looking collection of American art across media. So for those of you who are local, we invite you to visit at any time. The Addison is free and open to the public, and our exhibitions are always changing. All of our education programs are also free. We offer personalized visits. So we don't have a tour program per se, but you can contact either me or Jamie, and we offer personalized visits for school and community groups, as well as professional development support. So that's a little bit about the Addison. I'm going to turn it back to Jamie.
And I'm going to remember to unmute myself. Hi, everybody. It is so nice to see your faces. If your camera's not on and you'd like to share your face, please be willing to do so. Or please feel free to do so. That's what I meant. For those that I may not have met, so Christine and I are the education department at the Addison, and we are excited to work with you all today. In a minute, I will turn you all over to Tamar Avishai, who is the host of the podcast, The Lonely Palette. Tamar is an art historian and an independent audio producer based in Shaker Heights, Ohio, formerly of Boston, and we were very sad to lose her to Ohio. She is the one-woman band behind The Lonely Palette, which is the podcast that aims to make art history more accessible and unsnooty, one object at a time. Since its launch in 2016, The Lonely Palette has had notable mentions in the New York Times, in New York Magazine, Boston Globe, Hyperallergenic, Wired, and others, and has been aired on NPR, the BBC, CBC, WBUR, and HPR, and over various indie airwaves. It was awarded 2018 Boston's Best Podcast by the Improper Bostonian, by Improper Boston, and won gold in podcasting at the 2021 American Alliance of Museums Muse Awards. Tamar has produced podcast episodes in partnership with the MFA Boston, SF MoMA, the Harvard Art Museums, the Addison Gallery of American Art, Open Source with Christopher Lydon, and others. And since early 2020, she's been the podcaster in residence at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. She's also a co-founder of the Hub and Spoke Audio Collective. And I am very lucky to say that I have known Tamar for a long time, and behind the scenes, she is actually as warm and as witty in real life as she sounds in her podcast. Earlier this year, the Addison commissioned Tamar to create a limited series podcast for us that thematically explores works from the Addison's collection. And so Tamar looked thematically at a selection of some of the most provocative objects in our collection, and then talks about what they mean to art history and to each other. And the way that she draws people in and encourages connections absolutely echoes our own goals, which is why this was the perfect collaboration. And so as a plug both for us and for Tamar, I'm gonna paste the link in the chat if that is something that you're interested in listening to. Make sure this goes to everybody. And so that is the link to the podcast on our website so that you can see the images, but you can also, of course, listen to them wherever you download your podcasts. So, overview of the game plan for today. After Tamar's presentation, she's going to do a demo of how she does this work, so hopefully with your participation, and then we'll have time for Q&A. We didn't slot in a specific break time, but please take breaks as you need to. That's kind of the beauty of Zoom. Rather than waiting until the end for questions, please paste them in the chat whenever they occur to you. And we are going to gather them for the Q&A later. So feel free to populate the chat with your questions as we go along. And one of the nice things about this group is that we're a really diverse group of educators, and we're all coming at this work from different places, different starting points, from schools, from community groups, from museums, and we're all here to learn together, which I really appreciate. And then the last thing before I stop talking, If you would like more information, there's a couple places you could go. I'm going to paste the link if you would like to join the Lonely Palettes newsletter. I will say Tamar's newsletters are really entertaining. And so if you are not on her mailing list, I recommend you join it. And then also the list for the Addison Gallery's educator email, if you would be interested in joining that. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and I am going to turn you all over to Tamar.
I will remember to unmute myself. Jamie, thank you so much. Jamie and Christine, thank you so much for inviting me and really for kind of bringing me into the Addison in a way that I had never realized what the collection was. I don't know how many of you are familiar with actually going to the Addison or even just, and we'll have a chance to do this a little bit later, to search the object collection that they have online, but it is a world-class collection. And I don't think everybody realizes what the Addison really has. So it was a real pleasure to dive in there and a pleasure to, Jamie and I go way, way back to grad school. And, we've been able to kind of chart each other's professional journeys that bring us to this place. So I'm really glad to be here. Okay, I will share my screen and hopefully this all works. Okay, good. So art history as storytelling, how to hook, how to describe, and how to write. I don't claim to be an expert in all of these things, but I will say that the hook part is really what has kind of made, I feel like what has made the podcast get the traction that it has, because I think that people don't necessarily realize that art is something that can actually really hook people. And I learned I don't want to say the hard way, but definitely trial by fire, how to try to hook people. I was coming at it from an academic background, and I had studied art history in college. I studied in grad school, and then I found myself working at the MFA, giving tours that no one asked for. I was a spotlight talk lecturer, which meant that I would basically hang out in the corner of a gallery, and on the hour, I would just give a 15-minute talk in front of one painting. And I had to figure out how to make people stay because, usually people are pretty proactive when it comes to going on tours in museums. And if you just kind of start talking, then they have to figure out, did they actually stay and listen, or did they kind of find a way to back out slowly and pretend I didn't see them? And so in giving a tour that no one asked for, it became really important to recognize why, you can do this in lecturing and you can do this in audio. And this is actually really important for the podcast. You have to think about the fact that people can't anticipate what's coming. When they're just listening, you can't, it's not like you have a book or a magazine article where you can kind of, flip a couple pages ahead, or scroll all the way down, like see if this is something you want to stick around for. And you also can't go a couple pages back and say, oh, am I following the argument the right way? You really have to have people kind of in the palm of your hand and really present the entire time. And so it's really important when you're talking about these objects to really focus on really the principal elements of good storytelling. Not only are you kind of signposting, which is, making sure that people, like checking in, did you get this? Did you get that? Are you still with me? But think about who your characters are. What is the rising action? What is the falling action? What is the payoff at the end? Making sure that people feel like the end is worth sticking around for, and that it was something that was kind of alluded to at the beginning. And that there's a sense that whatever specifics we're going to be talking about is also going to have kind of larger real world consequences, that you can get the universal from the specifics of the story. And I think that people don't necessarily associate that with art. I don't think that people who come into a museum tend to think that art is something that is going to have universal consequences for them. That if they, people usually go to museums and they look at an object and all they can see, sometimes they relate to it immediately and they have a really great kind of interpersonal experience. And other times they look at it and they think, well, I've never been educated about this painting, so I don't know, like it's not for me to know because I haven't studied it. And when people realize that there's actually like accessible real world applicability from these objects to them, then they're much more interested to kind of stick around for the story. And so that, that is kind of a specific kind of constraint of audio and lecturing, that you can't actually see what's coming. So, kind of keeping people with you. So the story, kind of thinking about what the story is. I was at a conference, an audio conference a couple of years ago, and the New York Times podcast, The Daily, had just gotten off the ground and had really just kind of become like the podcast. And Michael Barbaro, the host, and Lisa Tobin, who's the executive producer, were there, and they were giving kind of a keynote about why what they do works so well for audio. And they talked about how journalism has what people expect to be an inverted pyramid, that you have to kind of expect in a newspaper article that people actually aren't going to read past the first paragraph. That's pretty universal. And so if you don't read past the first paragraph, then you have to get all the big information at the top. And then as you go down, you're getting more and more and more specific, so that if people don't actually get to the end, they're not missing that much, which, but, it's a really interesting way of looking at a way of conveying information, kind of delivering information. And so what they said was that's traditional journalism, and that what The Daily does and what a really good kind of storytelling does is that it reinverts it, so that you actually you start with the specific. And you'll notice this, any New Yorker article you read is going to start this way. Every episode of The Daily starts this way, where it starts with an anecdote. It starts with somebody very specific who is having a very specific human experience, and you have a really, really good description, and you feel like, it's always like This American Life does this too. It's like, so there's Joe. He's a tall guy, blue shirt, like that kind of, that kind of way of describing somebody. And that becomes your point of entry into what will ultimately become a much larger kind of universal story. By the time you get to the end of it, you realize that Joe, who's tall with a blue shirt, is actually having an experience that will speak to you, that will actually relate to you. And so as the story is unfolding, you have this really cool opportunity to grab people with these really specific details that then they feel like ultimately kind of, connects your audience to these characters. And when I talk about characters, usually when I'm in the podcast, the character is me. I will kind of act as that point of entry, and something that I have experienced tends to be what then kind of leads me and everybody who's listening into the story of the artwork. And so I have to stop and think, okay, like the most important part of this episode, because every episode focuses on one artwork at a time, what is the larger base of the pyramid that everybody needs to take away, that the listener should take away to really feel like they understand this artist, this artwork in that, in the context in which it's going to be the most universal, the most accessible, and also really teach you about something that you might not have already known. And so, the fun kind of like alchemy of it is trying to think of what is a really good way to get into this artist in a way that might have nothing to do with art, but is something really anecdotal that I have experienced, or that might be a pretty universal experience. that is immediately going to grab the listener and kind of bring them in so that they're really primed to hear more about what this art is about. And so, like, I was going through some old episodes, and like, on the episode on Kandinsky and the Bauhaus, I talked about how my mom and I would like try to one up each other with like fake IKEA names, and like that was a good way of talking about how, you know, how much the Bauhaus aesthetic has been absorbed into our pop culture. You know, that's something that everybody can relate to. And so if you start with IKEA and then you move into, you know, kind of, you know, into Kandinsky, you can actually see that there's a through line that makes a lot of sense. Another one, and we'll actually come back to Jackson Pollock later, but a guy at school once told me that you can't actually describe how an accordion works without moving your arms. And I thought, like, oh, that's true. You know, you can actually do that. And that kind of, you know, insatiable dynamism where you just have to kind of move your body as a way of really understanding something led really well to standing in front of a Pollock and just kind of like feeling kind of the dynamism of that Pollock. So there is one example. I have some audio clips that I want to play. But this one in particular was pretty interesting because this is a Louise Bourgeois sculpture that they have at the MFA right now. And trying to describe this one, not only do I kind of like what I ended up with, but it was also really tricky to try to explain what bourgeois means to anybody, because she's really hard to describe. She's really, and I think I say this in there, she's very stubbornly uncategorizable. So there were a few false starts in this script, and I was trying to think about, you know, how do you distill her down to anything? Like, what is her essence? What is the base of the pyramid that I can get to really have somebody take away from this episode what kind of bourgeois, what experiencing a Louise Bourgeois sculpture can be? So I'll play this now.
So here's a fun fact about me. I am deathly afraid of snakes. They are the worst. The worst. I don't even want to be thinking about them right now as I say this, because it means that I am thinking about snakes, and that's horrifying. But I'm going to push through to tell you a story. It's about the time I was a camp counselor and wrangling all my 7-year-olds in their level 3 swimming class in the part of the lake where you could touch the squishy ground, which was bad enough anyway, when a wee little water snake, minding its own business, slithered out from under the dock and moved across the smooth surface of the water as though it was on the ground. I, of course, did everything my amygdala made me do when confronted with a primal fear. My mouth got numb, my teeth tickled, my stomach sank like a stone, and I hightailed it the hell out of there, probably screaming, and definitely George Costanza style, splashing multiple children in my wake. Fortunately, I had a co-teacher to handle my campers, some equally freaked out and some freakishly nonplussed, and the moment passed without any further incident. But I took it with me for a while. It was one of the few times I can remember being so aware of how out of control I was, how my lizard brain blindly perceived something as a threat and made my body act accordingly. You know exactly the feeling I'm talking about, whether for you it's snakes or heights or rodents or blown up balloons if you're my friend Phoebe, or of course, spiders. This feeling is instantaneous and overwhelming and about as primal as it gets. And maybe you could say that it's the price we pay for having a body, the tax our body charges us for putting it in danger, real or imaginary. This innate physical response, this visceral sense that something in our own bodies is off kilter and out of our conscious control. This purely instinctual desire for self-protection. The realization that by just having a body, it means that you're at the mercy of what's around you and inside of you. And for most of human evolution, it was our brains alone manufacturing this feeling. But then along came a spider. That is, along came the French-American artist Louise Bourgeois, who spent a lifetime of almost a century tapping into this uncomfortable and universal part of the human experience, making tangible this intangible feeling of disquiet. Her work is primal, psychologically charged, corporeal, repulsive, and moreover, stubbornly uncategorizable. She's been half adopted.
So that's a larger clip from the podcast episode, but that's just an example of how every episode really starts, is with an anecdote that will kind of tell you something, usually about me, but ultimately about tapping into what is really interesting about this artist. And I tried to think about what do all of these very disparate Louise Bourgeois sculptures have in common? Because, you've seen the giant spiders, you've seen, the penis head carved into rock, you've seen, pregnant bellies, and what she really does have in common from work to work, when I really kind of got down to it, is that it creates discomfort, that it creates a kind of primal, subversive, kind of bodily, sexual, erotic discomfort. And it just reminded me of the way that my own body reacts to snakes, and that, kind of tapping into a primal fear. And that seemed like something that a lot of people would understand. And trying to describe that feeling has nothing to do with the art, but it's a really good way to create something that everybody really does kind of understand. That is that hook. And then from there, then you can get into, a 20th century sculptor who, is kind of talking about different, issues about feminism and motherhood and, all of these other issues that are specific to Louise Bourgeois, but really we've all kind of gotten there together. So it's interesting. It's kind of like that pyramid flips around a little bit. But ultimately you want to have the specific speak to the universal and have the universal be the product of the specific. And so there's kind of an interesting question there that I think is worth addressing, which is, how much of myself do I share in this kind of a context? Because, if you're trying to give an educational lecture, you don't really want to get bogged down with your own personhood. You don't really want to over personalize, because that's boring. And, people don't know me really, they might not be that interested in, my anecdotes from camp. And it can be kind of navel-gazy. And not only do I want to protect a little bit of my privacy, especially, when I'm talking about intimate things, which I do, like my child and my marriage, you also want to create empathy. Empathy is a really, really important piece of this relationship between somebody gaining entry into understanding an artwork and why it will affect them, which is what I'm trying to explain from how it affects me. And so I like to think of it that you really have to think, like in any good conversation, you have to speak, you have to tell your anecdotes with the listener in mind. If you really want what you're saying to be received, you really have to think about the listener in mind. So what information are you really trying to impart at the end of the day? And so that's also, go back to the base of that pyramid. Like, what ultimately are they trying to get out of this? Are you trying to help them get out of this? If you're going to listen to an episode on Louise Bourgeois, you need to understand why spiders mattered to her, why the kind of deeper and larger truths that she's trying to access is instrumental in really understanding her work. And at the same time, it's nice to know that I have a fear of snakes, but it's not about me, it's about her. So how do you know when to hand off, your own personal experience into this larger understanding of what the artist is trying to do. And, just kind of recognizing that it's really important at a certain point, if you are the storyteller, when to put yourself away and when to kind of let the information take hold, because you've already kind of ushered people into the story, but now you can take a step back, put yourself away. And I think that's also important, because if there's too much of me in it, then my objectivity as an educator starts to be questioned. My credibility starts to be questioned. I become an art critic, not an art educator. My bias starts to show, and I want to kind of keep that at bay. I don't want necessarily the way that I feel about an artwork to influence the way that other people feel about artworks. This is not about what Louise Bourgeois means to me. It's about what she means to the world and to the larger art community. So back to the listener then, if you're going to create with the listener in mind, how do you know what the listener wants to hear? And this is something that I've actually, before the podcast even really started, I would go into the galleries, usually at the Museum of Fine Arts when I was giving these spotlight talks, and I would interview people and ask them, not ask them to give me any kind of art historical information or, their own narrative of the object. But I really wanted them to describe just what they saw, because that would be really helpful for me as a way of saying, okay, if this is what the listener is seeing, then how can I then work the argument towards that, so that they feel like what they're seeing is what they're supposed to be seeing. People come into museums largely, or people are confronted with artworks. And again, there's this kind of intellectual velvet rope around them, around the work. And they feel like if they are seeing something, it's probably not what they're supposed to be seeing, especially compared to what an expert sees an expert. And so, when you ask them to describe just what they see, then it gives them permission to put a little bit of themselves into the work. And they can see, okay, well, not only is this what I'm seeing, but it kind of reminds me of this, or, and you get some really, really wonderful answers. And so, for example, this Roy Lichtenstein at the Art Institute of Chicago, this one was particularly good for getting because there's text in it, you actually get to hear how different people are interpreting the "oh, all right" of this object. So let's play it and then we'll talk about it.
Okay, so what am I seeing right now? I'm looking at a woman and she's kind of comic style. The style is a comic book style, but like a closely cropped comic book. It feels like it's just one panel, like maybe the panels previous were zoomed out. She has bright red hair and she has red dots all over her face. She says, "Oh, all right. Oh, all right. Oh, all right. Oh, all right. Oh, all right." Could be like, "Ooh, all right," like in a good way, but like a bad way. How would you say it in a bad way? You're like, "All right," kind of like, okay. Because also the "oh, all right," you have no idea what it's about, and it feels like you're missing something beforehand.
I don't know, there's something really melancholy about it, even though it's like these really bright, intense colors. I don't know.
She doesn't look satisfied. She looks a little bit sad and a little bit resigned.
Her eyebrows. Like literally, it's her eyebrows. And that kind of like the look in, she's not really, really looking at anything. And I guess not many of us do when we're on the phone, but there's something about just kind of zoning out and staring into space.
And her words kind of reflect that resignation in her face. There's 3 H's and then 3 dots. So it has this feeling that it goes off. It just goes off into the ether. And it's just kind of like she doesn't really want to be saying all right. the O was like a stalling mechanism on her part. I'm like, oh, all right. It's like someone to call to say that he wasn't coming to pick her up for a date. Oh, all right. Ooh. For added effect. Oh.
So what I do, and we're going to have the chance to do this together, is I basically ask people to look at this with no art historical interpretation whatsoever, so not just to kind of describe what they see, but to describe what about it kind of speaks to them. So you have, the narratives that people project onto this painting are really interesting because not only are they really kind of rich, but they're really different. And so this is really what Lichtenstein was kind of getting at, but we'll get there, we get there later into the episode. What is so fascinating is to watch the way that people really do exactly what he was hoping that they would do, which is fill in the panels on either side. But, because he has this incredible ability to pull that one panel that is so narratively rich and also, kind of speaking a universal language without the panels on the other side. And so people are still able to kind of put a narrative together. So I want to give one more example of talking to people in the galleries and kind of getting what they get out of looking at the painting. But this is something completely different. This is not something that can be read narratively. It's something that just kind of, I asked people to really describe how it made them feel. And I have a cool thing here because this website kind of almost like as a fan video put together a whole animation that goes with the audio. So I wanted to play that for you too. Are you seeing this? Okay, here, I'll share it. Oops. Okay, let me just share it. Can you see that now? Okay.
Because you sit with it and you feel those emotions, and that abstraction really makes you slow down. This is the one I'm always drawn to. It's on a single wall all by itself, and then it's big. You can get up close to it and you lose total sense of where you are.
Rothkos are about color and the use of color and the expression of color. And everyone will react to those differently. And if you just haven't seen a Rothko that has that color combination that you get, then it won't mean anything. But when you see one, it's like, oh, I like how those work together. I like those colors together. I like how those blocks build. Then you get it, and then you have the
Almost like when you kind of for me, when you open your eyes up in the first part of the morning, it makes it be dark out and you're just picking up hues that are at first really undistinguishable. And then as you kind of slowly come to, you start to pick up a little bit more definition, but it's very soft. And I like the bottom part with the red is a little bit of like that consciousness kind of waking back up again.
There's a way in which there's a flatness that it's easy to project out to the world, but there's so much going on under the surface. And there's something really comforting about being able to walk closer and see something get richer than it seemed. I don't feel any bleakness about it. It's more like, I get you. I get what you need.
I was feeling pretty like skeptical as because I know Rothko's supposed to be great, but like somehow there was something about this painting that made me feel calm.
Yeah, I really love this because, these were all unprompted reactions to standing in front of a Mark Rothko. And people, if people feel like regular art is kind of gated, Rothko's like up there, where either, you can stand in front of a Rothko and have this incredibly cathartic experience in that moment, or you look at the guy next to you being like, I don't know, how they're experiencing that, but I'm not feeling anything. And so to, stick a mic in front of people's faces as they were standing in front of, and it wasn't just this one, there was a whole Rothko show at the MFA. People were incredibly, like they were tapping into something that I can't emphasize enough was purely association. It wasn't arty, like it wasn't necessarily to do with the artwork. It was where the artwork took them. It was the associations that they projected out onto it and where it kind of took them internally. And I think that kind of language is really, really important to tap into if you're explaining art to people, because then it separates it from feeling, again, like there is this kind of velvet rope if you don't have the art historical education. And instead, you can recognize why this is speaking to you in a way, and being comfortable and validating that kind of language. That it makes it much more universal and much more accessible. So the writing piece of it. Once you've created this argument and once you know how you're going to get in there, how do you write it out? And you don't have to read this. This is just this is an example. Early on, my dad's a writer. He's a journalist.
I think we're still on the YouTube screen. You want to switch it back?
Okay, sorry. All right, share screen. Here you go. Good? Okay, good. So early on, I used to send my scripts to my dad, and he would come back with, like everything that I had put into it to, shorten my sentences, make it sound really colloquial, make it sound really conversational. Because this is how, if you're listening, if you're thinking like a listener and you're speaking to a listener, then you have to be really cognizant that, again, they're not seeing what you're reading off of. So it's really important in your language, and again, whether this is audio or whether you're lecturing, that if you're going to hold them in the palm of your hand, it can't be like, if any of you speak German, that all the verbs come at the end of a sentence. So you really have to wait and see, like you have to wait for the whole sentence to find out what the beginning part was. You need to be able to write in a way that reinforces the conversational kind of informality and dynamism of speech. Speech is what's so popular about podcasts, because you feel like someone is telling you a story and you don't necessarily feel like they're reading you a story, but that they're really kind of, engaging with you, and that there is that kind of colloquialness. And so it was just really funny that, the edits that my dad made were largely to kind of make it more for print. And, you kind of realize, okay, this really is a different kind of writing. The kind of writing that you do for podcasting or for lecturing about art is largely about description. And again, as we just talked about, descriptive language is just that. You're describing in terms in ways that will reach the audience, even if they're not arty, even if you're not using art jargon. You're incredibly good at describing things. And if, if you're friends with any radio producers, they're really good at describing things because they always have to bring you into, Joe is tall with the blue shirt. Like they have to notice those kinds of details. So yeah, keeping language short, keeping it clear, keeping it really conversational. And what kind of research do you do for something like this? For me, for the podcast, my research actually doesn't go that deep. It's not really a question of, coming to some sort of like academic understanding of something that hasn't been, that's never been discussed. It's, again, what is the audience going to relate to? If a listener knows something about Picasso, but not a lot, what is the larger understanding that they're going to have? And then deciding, okay, well, is it worth pulling up an interesting kind of fact about this artist? Is it worth quoting the artist himself? Is it worth quoting a critic? How are you best going to, again, humanize the content, make it as relatable and accessible as you can? And so, there's some little like interesting factoids that you can pull up that make the artist more human automatically. For example, in the episode on Edward Hopper, early on, there was a great quote from his wife who describes him. She's talking about how, the thing about Eddie and, Edward Hopper, the thing about Eddie is that, he's so deep that, talking to him is like dropping a stone down a well, and you don't even hear the splash. So something like that. Not only is that a really great piece of writing, but it humanizes him immediately. He's Eddie. He had a wife. He was a person. And, and that really helps explain something very important about him that also really helps to kind of understand why his art was the way it was, why kind of his depth was so important. And yet there was still kind of a stillness above the surface. So, these are, again, pretty fundamental principles of storytelling. How do you humanize the characters? That then you're really just kind of applying to an artwork and hoping that people are going to kind of come with you into that story in the same way. Okay. Mistakes were made. I was asked to talk about things that I wouldn't do again. So, what have I learned basically in the process of going through this, how to kind of talk about art this way, how to write about art this way. And I would say that the overarching piece of it is, don't assume that your audience knows too much. I think that that's something that I have a tendency, to worry that if I'm saying something, it's like so obvious because I learned about this stuff around other graduate students, and then I would teach this stuff to, largely students who were already studying art history. So, I think that I had a tendency to be worried that I was somehow talking down to people if I was more specific, if I didn't kind of oversimplify. And I had one time when I was giving a spotlight talk at the MFA, I was talking about a Monet painting, and I kept my eyes on this one guy who really was like following every word I said. And he was, but he had like a very stoic expression, and he would just kind of nod, and he was making eye contact. And he just looked like a Harvard professor. Like, I don't know how else to describe him. And I was like, he's definitely weighing every word that I'm saying right now. And I got a little flustered even, I was like, he is so into this that he has to be judging me. Like, he has to be kind of making sure that I'm not going to mess this up. And so after the talk was done, he came up to me, and I felt like my heart drop. And he said, one thing about this painting, really, like, this is an original Monet? And I was like, yeah. And he was like, and that one too? Like, they're all originals. And I was like, yeah, well, it's an art museum, it's like, that's kind of what it's for. And he was like, wow, huh. And like, he and his wife then like walked out of the room. And it was like, oh, okay. like my assumption that that he was kind of judging what I was saying was a little bit misguided because, I come from a very specific experience. And so, you don't want to assume that your audience knows more than they do, because you really do want to help explain the entire story. And you want people to feel comfortable and feel like they're coming away with, newfound knowledge, and that they're not, that their worries that they don't know anything aren't being basically validated. At the same time, don't imply that they know too little. Don't imply that, well, I'm sure like there are ways to kind of strike that balance so that people don't feel dumb for not knowing of this stuff going in. I think that that's really important to show that you're kind of meeting people where they're at and extending a hand and kind of taking them with you. And so in my earlier scripts, I think I struggled with this balance a lot. When it comes to being lectured at or talked at, and they're not necessarily looking at the script, or even, maybe they're looking at the artwork, but not looking at a PowerPoint. Remember that when people are engaging their ears, it's at the expense of their other senses. So that's also really important to, like I said, kind of signpost, make really clear the direction that you're going in, because again, they can't flip back and forth. They can't make sure that they're following the argument. You have to kind of be with them and present and make sure that they are with you on that. And I've definitely kind of listened back to old episodes and lost my own thread, and realized, okay, well, if I'm losing the thread, then definitely my audience is. Don't assume that they all agree with you. I think that this kind of goes back to what I was saying about making sure that your biases are a little bit in check, and that you're not just telling your own story of this artist, but actually, kind of gathering sources and thinking more generally, more universally. So, I will listen back and realize that there were some kind of assumptions that I was making about who my audience was, and that we all maybe came from the same academic place or political place, or, and that I was kind of editorializing a little bit. And I think it's important to recognize when you're trying to reach a lot of people that, objectivity matters. And at the same time, also remember, going back to that guy in the gallery, that you usually have a pretty generous audience. They want to learn this stuff. Like they want to, if they're in the position to learn, they want to receive. And I think that was something that I was so worried that everyone was like grading me and making sure that everything I was saying was like really, really academically sound. Like, obviously I want it to be correct, but that I was trying to kind of keep a kind of academic tightness to it, that I didn't appreciate that people were really happy to just get any information that they can then do something with. So shall we move on to our demo? All right. So you all have your computers in front of you. If you want to actually look at the object, we're going to be looking at Jackson Pollock's Phosphorescence. If you want to actually pull it up on your own computer, go to addisongallery.org. And you can see the collection. And then if you hover over that, you can search the collection, and then go to an object search. And you'll be able to just type in Jackson Pollock and this object will come up. Should I give everyone a minute to do that, or what do you guys say?
I've also put it in the chat if it's easier for people to just click that, but feel free to practice using the Addison's website as well.
Yeah. So what I wanted to kind of do was give you a sense of what I would do if I was actually in the gallery with you and collecting the tape that I use at the beginning of the episode. So the first thing that I usually ask somebody, and I think that the responses here should, as Christine just said, like type your responses if you want to participate in this into the chat, and we'll go through it in a minute. But I really just ask people first and foremost, what they see. And that seems really basic, but it's actually very, like, it's asking people to look at art in a way that they're not actually that familiar with, even though it's something that they can all do. Which is, you know, I like to say, okay, imagine that you're on the phone with somebody who's not in the gallery with you. And they ask you, okay, what are you looking at? And just, you know, well, you start with the size. I mean, it's harder to do on a computer screen, but like, you know, does it feel like, how would you describe this? How would you, you know, to somebody who can't see it, how would you describe what you're looking at? I always say, you know, the less art historical interpretation, the better. In fact, none is preferable. Like, don't try to interpret what you're seeing, just describe it. What does it remind you of? What does it make you think of? How does it make you feel? You know, do you notice anything happening to your body one way or another by standing in front of this? Yeah, I'll kind of give people a minute to just put their own descriptions into the chat.
And we can read things aloud from the chat, so don't feel like you have to type and read at the same time.
Mm. Do you want us to go ahead and start, if anything has come up?
Sure. Liz says that the texture reminds me of those rubber ball bands that people make, overlapping in tension, pulling in all directions.
Nice.
Claire says black, white, and yellow paint. Splatters on a gray background. It is visually overwhelming.
Mm. Yeah, I love that rubber ball, that rubber band ball. That's awesome.
Yeah. Erin says, for me, I want to explore the layers with my fingers.
Mm.
I'm thinking more of spider webs upon spider webs. That's something that's tempting for me as well. And there's a reason this painting is behind glass, because I'm sure other visitors also are tempted to run their fingers through this. Ellie says dozens of straight roads all leading to different places.
Mm.
Vanessa says white lines like pieces of string that are connected to one another. Lucy says it looks a little like a spider walked through a paint box overnight and made a home on the canvas.
That's awesome.
Lisa says that makes me think of trees when I'm hiking. Leaves changing colors and the forest floor just a mess of decomposing matter. Claire says concrete, glue, egg yolk, ridged textures. Which layer's on top, which is underneath.
Mm. You guys are good. Yeah.
Maria says a nest, freshly painted. Susan says makes me feel that a bunch of spools of thread were dropped and rolled out at their own rate. Generis says chunky, layered. I feel busy. Reminds me of New York for some reason. Maybe the busy feel, the gray and random sparks of yellow.
Yeah, I mean, what's great about this is that I don't think that this is necessary. You know, when art historians get together, they don't talk like this. You know, like it's very, not just because we're all trying to impress each other, but because there's a way that we train ourselves out of looking at art that I think we don't realize is actually the point of entry into it. And especially when you're bringing it to people who are not comfortable talking about this stuff, which is everybody. So, you know, there's a great way that if we kind of retrain our own minds to look at what we think other people see, that's really helpful because they're trying to see it the way that we see it. You know, they're trying to see it in a way that tells them that they get it. And I think that looking at it like, you know, New York, like, you know, spools of unraveled thread, like egg yolk, like, you know, that really the takeaway from all of this is to be comfortable seeing these objects as you would imagine anybody seeing it, and then saying, okay, so what then does my art historical background bring to this? And how can I start not from the academic place and explain it, but from the viewers, from the listeners, from the audience, and pull it back and say, okay, why are they saying that? Because it almost always very organically leads to why the artist made those decisions. And I'll play you actually just one last clip, because I did an episode on Jackson Pollock. This is his number 10, 1949, from that's at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And their descriptions were really similar and equally great. And so this was a real education for me, because I looked at this and I wasn't sure how I was going to start. I mean, I did the accordion thing, but from there, it's like, how do you describe Jackson Pollock? How do you make people comfortable with what they're basically getting, like the frying pan in the face, like what they're seeing that is so powerful? And their descriptions were just incredible.
Well, what I see is an oblong canvas, and the artist has taken paint that drips, that's liquidy dripping, not thick, from a palette, and just swirling it and throwing it and dabbing it and spotting it all over, but in a very semi-controlled way, so that it has a rhythm that is not accidental. I mean, it's not accidental how this all worked out.
Black, green, white, red, bluish, greenish. You kind of see like writing in the black, like an O and an A and then another A, W. It kind of makes me feel lost in the painting. Yeah. Like I'm in the painting and it makes me feel lost.
It looks like a sort of almost religious dripping of the brush in circles around and around and around. And
you were doing it with your right hands when you were describing Pollock.
Oh, I was moving it in a circle, I think, right? I mean, I don't know, it was like very subconscious, so I was moving it in a circle. It's a very physical reaction. And that's, if you think about how tortured he was and how emotional his work is, of course, you have to have some sort of physical, visceral reaction.
To me, this is kind of expressing a chaos, kind of controlled chaos in a way, because altogether it looks crazy and chaotic and random, but if you kind of separate the colors, you can see almost patterns in the way he composed this painting.
It's like, in a way, like free jazz, because if you try to listen to the whole, you won't understand, but if you just pay attention to one instrument, it sort of makes more sense. Like if you're just listening to one sax, it's playing a lot of very beautiful melodies, but in the context of everything, it's just a mess.
Yeah.
Yeah, like because of that guy, I thought, jazz that is hard to kind of listen to all at once would actually be a really good, would be really good music to put under this. I had a very hard time separating my own art historical knowledge from the object itself. And that's why interviewing all of these people and how much emphasis they put into movement and how much emphasis they put into kind of recognizing, which was also a comment that came up, that you don't know which layer came first, and that there's a cacophony here, but it's also oddly controlled, like a controlled chaos, that helped me see this painting for the way that they see it, and helped made the episode, I think, a lot more successful than it would have been otherwise. So should we hand it off to some Q&A?
Yeah, we have some questions, and we can feel free to unmute yourself if you have other ones as well. I'll start with kind of what we had from earlier. You had asked the question earlier, how much of myself do I share when talking about the story before calling your bias, objectivity, credibility into question? And I have a similar question about the projection of narrative on the artwork before missing the mark of the artist's intention. Do you wonder about a balance?
Oh, yeah.
A balance there?
Yeah, all the time. And that's actually interesting because it's not just, it's not just me. I mean, I think that every art historian and artist have kind of, butted heads at one point or another, because they're both coming at this, kind of larger trajectory of like, what is art from two really different vantage points. Art historians are about kind of looking at the forest, and artists are the trees. And it's not that artists don't necessarily look at each other. Of course they do, or look back or look forward. But, it's a very different kind of creativity. I know that my mom is here and she's an artist, and, she, like, our brains work really, really differently. The creativity that she is able to kind of create in the moment of creation is unbelievable to me. I'm much, much better at collating historical sources and kind of getting a larger sense of like how we got from X to Y. And so I think that, there's also the issue that comes up where, somebody's standing in front of a Rothko and they're having their own personal experience with it, and they don't necessarily care about the artist's intention. That's not necessarily their end goal from, experiencing this painting. And so to tell them like, well, it's really nice that you had this experience, but here's what Rothko meant, that is like the death of art appreciation. So trying to find a way to synthesize, the way that artists have explained themselves, and that's actually much easier if you are like me and you're a modernist, because artists, we have a lot more sources of artists actually explaining themselves and what they meant by things. Kind of taking their own descriptions, placing it in a larger historical narrative, which is something that I think that a good art historian can do really well. And then also letting the visitor find their own point of entry in before that information may kind of bias them or kind of affect them. Striking that balance is incredibly difficult, but I think that that's the job of a good art historian anyway. Not sure if that really answered the question, but yes, it is something I think about a lot.
I think you answered some of this as well, but in thinking about, so this question says, as an MA student in museum education, we're going over VTS, so for non-museum people, visual thinking strategies, where you ask a series of questions. What's going on in this picture? What do you see that makes you say that? And then what more can we find? So we're going over VTS and how to use it for a baseline for beginners looking at art. How do we encourage, or how do we get participants who have experience with art, so like art historians, to look and forget about their art historical knowledge? How do we explore and encourage the creation of knowledge? And then there was a similar question about visual thinking strategies. Just your thoughts about the approach.
Okay, well, I'll start with that one and then go to the other. I actually, when I first came across VTS, I was like, I hated it. I thought that the idea of making, like, I think I was confused actually about what it was really for. Because I think what VTS does, and just to kind of reiterate what you're saying, VTS, visual thinking strategies, this idea that what someone is seeing really drives the conversation, not starting from an art historical place and saying, do you see how that's present in the painting, but really kind of being driven by somebody seeing something. And, it's a tool. It's a tool in the toolkit. It's not everything. And if you are really interested in kind of, if this is why people like make fun of art history majors, because it's like, oh, you get to look at pretty paintings and it means whatever you want it to mean, because that's what art means, is whatever you want it to mean. And, every art historian ever has been like, not quite, like there's more to it than that. And so it's really important that VTS doesn't become the whole story, because then it falls into that bucket of, well, this is what I see. This is what I see that makes me say that. And they stop and they think, okay, well, then that's enough. I don't think anybody really thinks that that's the end of the story. I think that it is a tool. that largely, like we've talked about, puts a lot of the ownership on the viewer to find where their own points of entry are and to apply ideas that aren't necessarily, again, arty, but really speak to them. And then if you are facilitating that conversation well, then you are able to pull from what the viewer is saying and saying, okay, there's a reason why you see that. You know, I mean, that to me, like, I know that that's not like pure VTS, and like my information is 15 years out of date. So when it comes to actually, you know, like studying museum education, but I always found that I was like a little bit too critical of that strategy at first. I really see its value now, but I also recognize that it is a tool and that it's the responsibility of the facilitator to do with that tool, you know, to use it and kind of deploy it in a way that leads to a more empathic understanding of the artwork. So then what was the first question again?
Thinking about how people who have experience with art, like art historians, to kind of forget about their
like, how do we, yeah. Well, I mean, you guys just all did it. So I think that that's really like, give yourself permission to see it as though you've never seen it before, and what strikes you, you know, and just recognize that most people looking at these objects are just a lot less secure in feeling comfortable that they're seeing what they're supposed to be seeing, and that what they do see has real resonance. And then again, kind of from there, try to disassociate what you know with what you see. And then you can make those connections again, but like start with what you see.
We also had some questions about just how you select the objects that you cover on your podcast. So I'll kind of group some of them together, but just thinking about representation between artists, time period, media type, subject matter, discussing controversial pieces, focusing, you know, how do you focus more on art that you like? You know, how do you avoid ones that you don't like? And how important it is for you just to have an overall balance in the selection that you cover over time.
Definitely when I was starting out, it was easier to only focus on objects that I wanted to talk about, you know, like, because I didn't think anyone was listening. And so it was like, whatever I wanted to talk about at the MFA became kind of de facto what I would do a podcast episode on. I realized that I definitely was gravitating towards the art that I had really focused on in school. And so I wanted to, you know, it took me a while to kind of break out of the, you know, late 19th, early 20th century modern European, because that was my area of focus. And I would find myself like really splitting hairs between, you know, a Cezanne and another Cezanne, and then kind of like, and then here's ancient art, you know, like that when I started recognizing that I was doing that, I thought, okay, I think I need to diversify this a little bit more. I've definitely run into realizing that I can't talk about one artwork without having talked about a movement that came before it. Otherwise, it wouldn't really necessarily make sense. So I was at actually the Art Institute, and there was a Jasper Johns Target, which is at the Addison, but the one that they have at the Art Institute, I was reading up on it and I was like, okay, well, how do I describe this? Because this is neo-Dada. So how do I, like, but I haven't done Dada yet. So how could I possibly talk about neo-Dada without actually, you know, I've never done an episode on Duchamp. I haven't done, you know, I've never talked about a ready-made before. So even though these objects are kind of dropped really randomly, there are definitely some that required something that came before it. And the same thing happened actually with the Georgia O'Keeffe episode that I did with Deer Skull and Peternal. Like, there's a very clear association that she makes, like a reference to the way that Mount Fuji is painted in the Great Wave. That is part of that painting, but I hadn't done the Great Wave yet. So it was a good opportunity to kind of first do one, then do the other. And then I wanted to really challenge myself. Like I wanted to actually start doing objects that I had never studied, that I didn't really know how to, like where my point of entry was going to be. I really wanted to have more of a diversity of artists and movements. One of the first 1-star iTunes review I got said that because I hadn't done a woman artist yet, that it was really shameful. And 3 days later, I released an episode on Mary Cassatt that was all about like, why, what art history's like woman problem was, which, like that person didn't know and they never updated their review. But, that told me that people are keeping an eye on that kind of thing. So, really trying to make sure that I am not only focusing on, the dead white men, that there are a lot of other artists there that are worth exploring too. And so, I think that was really important, both to recognizing, where the limitations of my own art education had been and how I was going to, just try to see the canon as bigger and richer than I had imagined it to be.
Thank you. Then we have kind of a logistical question, I guess, and thinking about how long you spend on each episode in terms of like what part of the process do you spend the most time on? Is it choosing the object? Is it the research? Is it the writing? Just kind of breaking that down for us.
The writing. 95% of every episode is the writing. And then once that's done, like my reward is getting to edit the audio, because that to me is really zen and enjoyable. And the writing itself is so hard. So, it really does feel like every episode is a script. And then from there, kind of turning it into an episode and adding, the actual recording process, the editing process, adding music, editing those opening voices, that's all fun and it goes pretty quickly. So that's, getting to practice my ear in that way is really like, the payoff. The writing itself and kind of, I have to start with the anecdote, because that tells me what the rest of it is really going to be about and what it's going to tie back to. So again, that hook. Like I have to figure out what the hook is first and foremost, and then the rest of it kind of fills itself in. The rest is logistical names and dates and people, places, but really understanding what the overarching story is I think where kind of the real energy comes in. Yeah.
Can I add a question, sneak in my own question related to this as well? I think similar to what we were doing, like with the Pollock, in terms of brainstorming, I think I assume some of us are familiar with just kind of making that brainstorm list of like what you see in an artwork. Yet when you shared your little excerpt in the beginning about with the anecdote with the snake, or when you describe in listening to your podcast, when you describe a work of art, it feels very different from that just kind of bullet point list of, what an artwork looks like. And so where do you go from like the very basic descriptive kind of list form to the really beautiful descriptive writing that you're so good at?
I mean, it serves two different purposes. Like talking to people and having them kind of describe what they see. I think the organic transition into how then I'm going to enter into the object is, kind of collecting that what people see and what it reminds them of is the way that they relate to it. And so what is their kind of a universal experience that I have had, a specific, but then turns into a universal experience, a specific to me that then is kind of relatable. That then, when I was actually standing in front of the Bourgeois, and that's actually, it's a tricky example, because that's not like as like squicky as Louise Bourgeois gets, like that particular one. But people were really struck by how that column that's supposed to just be a column looks weirdly human. That was kind of the piece of it that kept coming up over and over again. And it was like, that helped me trust my own experience of being around a whole bunch of Louise Bourgeois sculptures and thinking, God, the thing that just brings them all together is how human they are, you know, how kind of tapping into something very, very corporeal and bodily she does. And so it's like, even a column, she manages to kind of give a waist and give a kind of organic sensibility to. And people were seeing that, even though it was a very easy object to just walk by. You know, it wasn't something that really reached out and grabbed you the way that, you know, it's not like going to Dia Beacon and walking into that room and it's completely full of spider, you know, and, you know, you just feel it. Like, it just wasn't one of those kinds of sculptures. And yet people still, when you really ask them to look, were surprisingly affected by the shape. And so then, you know, kind of listening to that over and over again gave me the confidence almost to be like, okay, that's what I see too. You know, like, that's actually a really good way to get into this. And so from there, it was like, okay, when has my body ever kind of betrayed me that way? Oh yeah, that time that snake, it can't, you know, and that then kind of turned into what ended up being a really good way to address, you know, to address her work.
Thank you. And I think I'm going to sneak in this last question. Can we discuss turning the big idea on its head and how to find that descriptive catch anecdote?
Yeah. Can we be more specific? Like, whoever asked that, are they comfortable? Kind of like, what about it? Like, what can we cover a little bit more deeply? Is anyone brave?
Hi, sorry, it was me. I just figured it'd be easier to chat than to try and type it out. I'm just new to art teaching, so this is super exciting. I do have experience with BTS, and it's kind of like what you were just talking about, like your personal experience, just kind of, I guess, soul searching into how you can get that catch. So I don't know, I think you could kind of answer it, and I think it just maybe comes with practice, but really thinking about maybe discussing more about how you pull out what concept you want people to learn. Like, maybe start with where that big idea is and how you pick that big idea out with art.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you for clarifying. I think that, honestly, and I hate to admit this, but I find it's very, very helpful to go to Wikipedia and see what people have to, you know, what are other people's first, you know, lines, not of defense, but, you know, like, what is the first information that people come to? Because everybody uses Wikipedia. And so everybody will, you know, it's like, what's going to be at the top of the Picasso page? What's going to be at the top of the George O'Keeffe page? And that's actually very helpful for getting a really good baseline sense of what people are expecting to learn about these artists. And, you know, that's not obviously that's not enough, you know, that's why there's us. But it is very helpful in, again, starting where, you know, meeting your listener where they're at, meeting your viewer where they're at. And so then you can say, okay, you know, George O'Keeffe, like, Jamie, give me some like good, I can't think of, you know, but like you and George are tight. Like, you know, what are like the first things that people think of with her?
I would say skulls and images of the Southwest.
Yeah. Yeah. And well, and vagina flowers, but that's, you know, that gets a little debunked. But, you know, like, that's actually like, so like, why vaginas? Why, you know, yeah, genitals, exactly. Like, you know, so that is, that was actually very, I even started the George O'Keeffe episode because this guy, this like dude was, I asked him, you know, like, okay, well, just describe what you see. And he was like, and it's the deer skull, you know, so it's a deer skull with a mountain in the background. It's not, you know, kind of what people usually associate with O'Keeffe. And that's what he said. And he was like, it's not what I expect to see with Georgia O'Keeffe. And I asked him like, oh, and what is that? And he bursts out laughing. And, you know, it's like right away, people know what is and isn't being said. And so, you know, that's just a good example, I think, of, again, kind of meeting your audience where they're at and letting what they expect to see feed into where you as the educator want to take them, because it's really helpful to know where they're starting at. And so I would say kind of, you know, where, like, what's the universal and what's the specific, and, you know, which way are you going to go about it? You know, there are universals out there that people will kind of distill an artist, a famous artist, down to a few talking points, a few bullet points. And it's helpful to know what those are, to then, you know, subvert them, to then texture them, to then kind of challenge them. And especially if knowing what that expectation is and kind of what you want them to get out of it, then triggers in you some good anecdote that can kind of help facilitate that process. So Janine, I don't know if that really answers it for you, but I do find that, you know, there are ways you can find out what people think they already know and then go from there.
All right, so thank you. While I wish we had another hour and a half to pepper you with more questions, I have the feeling we need to let everybody go. So thank you to Tamar for sharing your wit and your wisdom and your warmth with us. That was unintended alliteration. Thank you to our Greater Boston Museum Educator Roundtable friends for joining us, and our Andover Breadloaf friends. And thank you all for joining us. I am one last time going to paste in the chat how to join our mailing lists if that is something you are interested in doing. And if you are local, I hope that you all come and visit us at the Addison soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.